Hi, and welcome to another episode of All Things Considered. Tonight, I want to speak to you about the Ninth Amendment, why it's there, why the Founding Fathers put it there, and what it's supposed to mean. I believe that there's a whole lot of people out there that don't understand it, and maybe deep down they don't want to understand it because they're comfortable with the way they believe. But it says here that the Ninth Amendment was supposed to be a catch-all amendment for our rights, rights that weren't written down, like the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, the Third Amendment, all the way up to the Eighth Amendment. It says here that the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. That's how it was written. It says here, this is another example of the founders' intent to make sure everyone understood the Bill of Rights. It is not a series of rights granted to the people, but it is in fact a series of restrictions designed to confine and restrain the government from its overwhelming desire to constantly encroach itself into the lives of the people it governs, instead of just simply letting them live freely without encumbrance. This amendment was added largely due to an anti-federalist concern that future governments of these United States might take the enumerated rights of the Bill of Rights as the only rights the people had that were protected from said government. This simple sentence clearly states that just because the founders didn't enter a restriction into the Bill of Rights, that doesn't mean that the people don't retain those rights. In fact, if there is any question as to whether or not we have a right to something, the Ninth Amendment indicates the government should consider that we do have that right instead of assuming that we don't. And most of the courts and governments will tell you that you don't have that right. Now, case in point, I just went to court. They got me for driving without a license. I live on federal property. They took me to federal court for one. On federal property, there is no law that says you have to have a license to operate a motorized vehicle, which I was on federal property according to the VA or the Veterans Administration, Homeland Security Police that wrote me the ticket. They said I was breaking a state law that says I have to have a license to operate a motor vehicle. According to the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and also the right to travel freely on the open roads, unencumbered and unfettered, that is a right that should have been protected by the Ninth Amendment. But when I was in court, the federal judge, not the state judge or the county judge, but the federal judge said that other judges have said that it's not a right. Therefore, he is going to go along with them and tell me that it is not a right. And I asked the judge, what about the Ninth Amendment? And he said, well, what about the Ninth Amendment? And I said, well, the Ninth Amendment says that just because the rights are not written down in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, that doesn't mean that it's not a right, and therefore you have to prove that it's not a right. You can't just say that it's not a right just because the state have said it's not a right and other judges have said it's not a right. You have to prove that it's not a right. And the judge told me, and it's in documents, the judge said, I don't have to prove anything. I'm a judge. It says here, interestingly enough, the amendment was largely left alone for most of the history of this great nation. It arose to prominence in 1965 when Justice Arthur Goldberg wrote an opinion citing the Ninth, specifically when he reasoned that the right to privacy, while not enumerated specifically in the Constitution, was nonetheless an obvious right retained by the people. That opinion came during the Griswold versus Connecticut case. The Griswold versus Connecticut is interesting for several reasons, some of them remaining topical to this very day. In Hartford, Connecticut in 1935, the very first Planned Parenthood office opened up, largely providing services to women who had no health care or access to a gynecologist. They also provided contraceptive information. They were compelled in the late 30s to comply with the 1879 anti-contraception laws. During the 40s, several court cases arose from this situation, and that began a series of legal challenges, many of them failing on technical reasons. Fast forwarding to 1961, Yale School of Medicine had one of their doctors challenge the law on behalf of its patients as a failure to obtain certain birth control methods was a threat to the lives of some of the women. SCOTUS dismissed that challenge on the lack of standing, as the doctor nor his patient had yet been charged. This dissent, written by John Marshall II, indicated it was his firm belief that the court should have heard this case, largely because the full scope of liberty guaranteed in the Due Process Clause cannot be found in or limited by the precise terms of the specific guarantees provided elsewhere in the Constitution. One of the questions that came up was whether or not the state of Connecticut intended to allow police to search the bedrooms of its citizens looking for evidence of contraception, violating the sanctity of the private material relationships all citizens believe they held. Marshall went on to add, "This liberty is not a series of isolated points pricked out in terms of the taking of properties. This liberty is not a series of isolated points pricked out in terms of taking of properties, the freedom of speech, press, and religion, the right to keep and bear arms in the United States, the freedom from reasonable search and seizures, and so on. It is a rational continuum which, broadly speaking, includes a freedom from all substantial arbitrary impositions and purposeless restraints." The second part, once again, reinforcing the notion that we the people are born with a multitude of national rights far beyond those enumerated in the first 8 amendments, and that simply because it had not been enumerated did not mean it did not exist. Knowing the libertarian natures of several of the founders, that idea of natural born rights is one I wholeheartedly agree with, and I wholeheartedly agree with that. It also sits well with the idea behind several of the amendment statements, such as "shall make no law" and "shall not be infringed." Our rights are not granted us by the Constitution. Instead, our Constitution and Bill of Rights are both mechanisms designed to restrict and rein in the avarice of government and the people who will become part of any governing body. In any event, after Marshall wrote that dissent, the Connecticut Planned Parenthood decided to challenge in which someone did in fact having standing due to being charged was in order. Consequently, they opened a birth control center and directly challenged the law. Miss Griswold, the director of the Planned Parenthood in Connecticut, was arrested, as was Dr. Buxton, and both were arrested, tried, found guilty, and fined. The Connecticut Appellate Court and the state Supreme Court both upheld the convictions, setting the stage for SCOTUS to take a look once again. The Griswold appeal focused on the 14th Amendment protections, and the case was decided by a 7-2 majority. Justice William Douglas wrote the opinion for the majority that a basic right to privacy, while not specifically enumerated in the Constitution, was still one retained by the people. Justice Arthur Goldberg concurred going as far as to use the Ninth Amendment to clearly state that the right to privacy was one of a host of other rights that the Ninth Amendment protects from government intrusion. There has been some serious back and forth amongst legal scholars regarding the concurring opinion and its use of the Ninth Amendment to justify a right to privacy. In my not-so-legal opinion, those that find there is no inherent right to privacy, which includes some powerful legal minds, are the ramblings of statistics attempting to justify yet more incursions into our personal freedoms. If one understands the founders, who they were, what they had just done, one should come away with a very simple understanding. The founders were not at all staticists. They never trusted nor believed that a government would ever act honorably unless fully contained and restrained by the people who consented to be governed. Consequently, when considering any law that bumps into a potential Bill of Rights protection, It is my non-legal view that the correct assumption is the one that limits government and permits the most freedom of action by the citizens of the United States is the one we should use, even if that is to the detriment of the government, as the founders didn't at all care how much government was inconvenienced as long as the people remained as free as possible. Now, I know this because I went to court, and upon going to court, the judge decided he was going to side with other judges to my right to free travel. And I wanted to appeal that case, but the federal government told me that I could not appeal, because if I appealed and I went all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States, the Supreme Court would have to make a decision, and it's possible that they would side in my favor, which could really screw up the state, because the state is making a load of money off of people paying for driver's licenses every day. And they didn't want to screw that apple cart up. So they wrote me a letter and they said that we are denying your right to appeal this case because it would impeach the officer's testimony. The officer that wrote me the ticket testified in court, and they said that it would impeach his testimony. They are denying me the right to appeal, which is against the law. So I got a lawyer, and we're going to sue, and we're going to sue big. We've long since drifted away from the rugged individualist nature of our founders, men willing to kill their former countrymen to avoid paying a minimal tax that all of them could easily afford, to instead start a new nation of equality under the law and representative government of the people with the consent of the governed. They were not staticists by any realistic definition of the word. We will fight you to the death on principle rather than concede and save ourselves the risk. It is my opinion that today most of our fellow Americans are only too happy to pay more in taxes and get more free government programs. We are hardly the stuff of individual accountability and responsibility today. That should sadden all of us to some degree. You will find the staticists among your friends and your colleagues. They pretend to be otherwise, but they are not and are easily discovered should one choose to find them out. They will often use the opinions of government to back their support of government. They will say things like, I believe in free speech, and it never matters what comes after, because it is simply a justification for another government intrusion into your protected right. That was a thing that I come across, which I found very interesting, and it kind of goes by what I believe in, and it was by somebody called Veritas Omnia Vincent. I'm not for sure exactly who he is exactly, but that's who wrote this, and I pretty much agree with everything he wrote. I couldn't have put it any better. That's why I read what he wrote, because I agree with it. We are willing to give up our rights every day because we are used to the government telling us what to do instead of us telling the government what to do. That's all I have on this for tonight. I hope that you were able to make it through this and it was understanding to the point where you got something out of it. Anyway, if you like my videos, please put a thumbs up. If you want to subscribe to my videos, please hit the bell and the subscribe button. If you think I should be put 6 feet under in cement galoshes, please let me know that in a comment. If you have an idea for a video that I can do, put it in the comment. If you think I can do this better and you know how I can do it better, put a comment. I'd love to hear from you. This has been All Things Considered. Have a good night, America, and all points beyond.